It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Sir Edward, my Penistone and Stocksbridge constituency is a cross-border constituency taking in North Sheffield and everything west of the M1 in Barnsley. In fact, it crosses the M1 in Dodworth to go right into the heart of Barnsley itself, with the boundary line just west of the district hospital. A third of the constituency on the western flank sits in the Peak District National Park. Even the eastern flank is, for the most part, made up of small towns and villages, separated by farmland, green open spaces and woodland. I am sure my constituency is the sort of place that those who originally devised Greenbelt policy had in mind when they wanted to protect areas from urban sprawl in the early post-war period. Indeed, it is estimated that approximately 70% of the land in my constituency enjoys Greenbelt status. Sir Edward, I think everyone agrees that we have a housing crisis. We simply don't have enough stock to supply today's needs, never mind the needs of future generations. It's not a new problem, with successive governments failing to get new homes built and to reform what is essentially a broken housing market. As we know, under the former Labour government, housing requirements were calculated at a national level and targets were set for each regional planning authority. The regional planning mechanism had then to allocate numbers from this target for each local planning authority, with land set aside by these latter authorities to satisfy the target. Once land had been zoned for housing, of course, individual planning applications were more likely to be approved, a principle that's still in place now. That all changed with the accession to power of the coalition government and the subsequent abolition of regional spatial strategies. Decision-making was apparently being returned to local level, and democracy was being restored. I remember the debates here very well around this claim made by the Conservatives when they were in opposition. Despite the abolition of housing targets, local authorities were still required, however, under the new arrangements, to set aside enough land to satisfy housing demand. And the mechanism for doing this has now been dubbed the local plan. Part of the planning process for this requires the development of a strategic housing market assessment to assess housing need. In other words, local authorities have been required through the National Planning Policy Framework to identify enough land for housing growth. The impact of this policy change is already being seen. According to CPRE, the number of planning applications being approved year on year, both on greenfield sites in the Green Belt and for large-scale housing development within areas of outstanding natural beauty, has nearly doubled since the National Policy Planning Framework came in force in 2012. The impact of this planning process is therefore significant. In Barnsley, for instance, meeting the target would involve building 20,000 new homes. CPRE in 2017 identified 5,700 threats to the borough's green belt. And we will soon see what the allocation looks like for Sheffield, as the draft local plan is imminent. But it needs to be pointed out that in 2017, CPRE reported 6,100 threats to the green belt designations in the city. Now, as I've said earlier, we all recognise the need for more housing. However, despite the government's pledge that greenbelt land will be protected, the truth is very different. Indeed, in both the authorities that cover my constituency, the green belt has had to be examined during the process of putting together a draft plan for publication and consultation. These reviews have taken place, though, alongside a call to developers for suitable sites to be brought forward for consideration in the local plan. This effectively has resulted in a dramatic cumulative impact. High target numbers have combined with Greenbelt review and the traditional call to developers to put previously out-of-reach sites within the grasp of those wanting to put shovels in the ground. Thus it is that our Greenbelt protection is in danger of being eroded in my constituency. And worse still, the idea that brownfield sites should come first has been downgraded. Brownfield sites, unfortunately, often require intensive preparation and, I acknowledge, can soak up significant resource. Local authorities often have to be really proactive to get these sites fit for market as housing land. No wonder then that developers tend to go for the easy options. I don't particularly blame the developers for that, and which in any case tend to offer better returns. In the Barnsley part of my constituency, the local plan is almost complete. And as I have already said, we're about to start the process in Sheffield. We are told by the government that democracy is at the heart of the process. But the experience of my constituency is somewhat different. Indeed, a criticism raised in 2016 by the Campaign for Rural England was that the government's local plan expert group completely failed to grasp the need for meaningful public involvement in the development of local plans. It was clear to CPRE and very disappointing that the government preferred instead to consult on a fully drafted plan rather than allowing sufficient time for focused consultation on issues and options. In other words, the plans are developed in private, behind closed doors, and then put out as a complete draft with no significant involvement on the part of local communities. Even in areas where local people have spent many hours working up their own neighbourhood plans, a concept encouraged and put in place by legislation by this government, and which I support, we have seen them ignored by the government's inspectors. In one example in my constituency, a neighbourhood plan made reference to an area of greenbelt land which local people thought should remain designated. The strong local view was based on an acceptance of the need for more housing, and indeed the plan had more housing incorporated, but that it should be affordable and located on the developed side of the Don Valley. This aspiration was completely ignored at public inquiry by the inspector, effectively forcing Barnsley Council to put the sites in the next draft plan. And they were totally contrary to the neighbourhood plan. It was only when the unelected Historic England intervened that the sites were removed, because they threatened the historic setting of a listed packhorse bridge that crosses the River Don. Thank God for Historic England, I say. But where is local democracy in all of this? Neighbourhood plans are supposed to represent the best of local democracy, and planning inspectors are riding roughshod over them. As I have already said, Sheffield is about to embark on its own formal consultations as required by the local plan process. The city's population is approximately twice the size of Barnsley, and the urban area is much more densely populated. But it is nevertheless a city where green spaces are enormously important. Indeed, a significant proportion of the city lies within the boundary of the Peak District National Park. I have to say the early signs are worrying. The City Council is adamant that brownfield sites are to be prioritised, and that it is only by having a robust plan that we will be able to keep the right balance between the ambitions of developers and the best interests of the city. I believe the Council is genuinely committed to these outcomes, but history tells me that it will have to work very hard to do so, especially after what we've seen in Barnsley, where the planning inspector insisted on significant extra sites in our villages were included in the plan that Barnsley had submitted. In this case, as with Barnsley, the odds are somewhat stacked against success. And yet CPRE informs me that there is no need to build on green belt or green spaces in Sheffield. It has 5 years of deliverable land supply on brownfield land and 11 years land supply on brownfield in total, land for 13,145 homes. But I remain sceptical about Sheffield's ability, because of government policy, to avoid that outcome. Past experience has also shown that all too often affordable housing plans are overturned in favour of houses that deliver a higher profit margin. Promised infrastructure upgrades are seldom completed, and green sites are used instead of the more expensive to develop brownfield sites. In evidence, I once again turn to CPRE. which reports that nearly 3/4 of the housing proposed on land to be released from the Greenbelt will be unaffordable for most people living in the local area. In fact, planning consultants Glenigan found only 16% of homes built in the Greenbelt since 2009 were affordable. I started this contribution by making it clear we all understand more housing needs to be developed in order to meet the current and future demand. But I reiterate the key point. It needs to be the right housing in the right places. A significant proportion of the new housing we need should be affordable, whether it is for sale or for rent. And as much as possible, this new stock needs to be provided in urban areas on brownfield sites. But what are the chances of achieving this, given the current shape of government policy? The calculation of housing need, for instance, is opaque, with the CPRE saying that government should make the method for calculating housing need clearer, and it should also be more clearly integrated with what is realistically achievable. It then goes on to say one of the key flaws of the approach is an overemphasis on market signals as part of objectively assessed need assessments. This is exactly the problem. The provision of new housing provides valuable economic activity, yes. And as I say, I don't blame the developers for pursuing attractive Greenbelt sites, but it also fulfills an extremely important social need. We need a policy which delivers the housing that's necessary for our young people, for people on low incomes, for single-person households. But we are not going to achieve this crucial social outcome under the current policy framework. What we will see, if we are not careful, is overdevelopment in small towns, such as Penistone in my constituency, which is threatened by a 30% increase in size. A small market town, a 30% increase. That will destroy the character of Penistone. And the houses that will be built won't be the ones we need for local people, but rather more expensive offerings that will threaten the social mix which currently characterises the communities that make up my largely rural constituency. And in a county where the social divide is so huge, where there's a 14-year life expectancy discrepancy between one part of Sheffield and the other, how can it be justified, a policy which threatens to destroy the social mix in those areas where we enjoy it, a reasonable, well-balanced social mix, and where we'll actually make that divide even deeper and more difficult to deal with? At the heart of Greenbelt policy is a desire to stop urban encroachment.
I don't know whether there's one or more divisions, but we'll resume as soon as the member in charge and the minister return. So we'll just play it by ear, depending on how many divisions. All right?
Thank you.
Angela Smith.
Thank you, Sir Edward. The interruption in many ways has been very welcome because we're now joined by my honourable friend, the member for Barnsley Central, who is also the Sheffield City Region elected mayor. So I'm very pleased that he's joined us. As I was saying, at the heart of Greenbelt policy is a desire to stop urban encroachment and to preserve our smaller towns and villages. While I appreciate that sometimes Greenbelt does not serve that purpose any longer and that it should be changed, it has to be said that the majority of Greenbelt does still fulfil that important role. It is also worth noting the potential impact on our natural environment. Our Greenbelt covers 53% of all the farmland subject to environmental stewardship schemes and 30% of the local nature reserves created between 2009 and 2015. How on earth can we expect to meet our biodiversity targets, the government's targets, if we pursue the current trajectory? And worryingly, the Minister's Department is currently consulting on a weakening of the protection for local wildlife sites in the MPPF. I would appreciate his comments on this key point, which is a source of great worry to the Sheffield Wildlife Trust. Time and time again, we hear this government talk about protecting the Green Belt, but then we find that its call for sites approach to local plans effectively encourages the reviews of Green Belt by local authorities, such as Sheffield and Barnsley, that has significant proportions of Green Belt. In Sheffield's case, the proportion is 63%. Barnsley's Green Belt coverage is 79%. So will the Minister give assurances that Green Belt policy is more than just warm words and that brownfield first really does mean that? At the heart of the process of creating a local plan should be local democracy and local involvement, yet the opposite in my experience seems to be the case. Time and time again, constituents tell me they feel outside the process. And it is because local constituents have asked me to bring this matter up here that I applied for this debate. The consultations, constituents tell me, feel like tick box exercises and that they are often, and they feel very often, faced with a fait accompli. So can the Minister give assurances that local people's views do matter? And will he instruct councils that they should take local people with them when forming their plans? And will he tell his planning inspectors that the same standard is expected? And will he look at reviewing housing policy to ensure that we deliver the homes we need where we need them? Large numbers of my constituents have lived in small villages and towns for generations. They love their communities. All the research done by the Countryside Alliance has demonstrated that one of the key factors for people living in rural areas is that they genuinely love the communities that they live in. And it's not NIMBYism to want to preserve the integrity of the places they live in. Yes, they accept new housing is needed. In Oxspring, the village I referred to earlier, the neighbourhood plan reflected the need for new housing. And indeed, most of my constituents recognise their children will benefit from a proportionate increase in housing stock in their communities. I conclude, therefore, by saying, when will the government drop its ideological approach to this policy area, adopt the mantle of Macmillan and previous Tory governments, and deliver the housing we need rather than the housing that the developers think that we need?
Sir Edward, great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and my apologies if I delayed proceedings during the divisions. Can I congratulate the Honourable Lady for securing this important debate? I'm delighted to be here today to respond to the points raised, not least because they are points very close to my heart as somebody who represents a very rural and beautiful constituency too. It is clear from everything the Honourable Member said that both the green belt and green spaces are important to both herself and her constituents, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about these issues and to underline the government's commitment to maintaining its strong protection. I should, though, Sir Edward, first point out that, as members will know, the Secretary of State has a quasi-judicial role in the planning system, so I'm sure you'll understand that it would not be appropriate for me to comment on the detail of individual decisions or plans. However, I can talk about the issues raised more broadly. I shall set out what more we are doing to protect our natural environment whilst also building the homes we need, as well as our national policy on the green belt and green spaces. This government is committed to protecting our precious environment, placing great importance on striking a balance between enabling housing and commercial development, whilst also continuing to protect and enhance the natural environment, minimising the impact on biodiversity. In particular, our planning reform package, which includes the revised draft National Planning Policy Framework and reforms to developer contributions, are fundamental to ensuring that we are improving the environment at the same time as delivering the homes we need. The revised NPPF will be published shortly. One of the key ways we're continuing to protect the environment is through the provision and protection of green spaces. These are part of our natural heritage, providing balance in urban areas and improving the quality of life for all. Indeed, safe and accessible green infrastructure can play an important role in addressing health and well-being needs, something that is particularly needed in our local communities and indeed in modern society generally. However, the government recognises the development pressures that areas such as green spaces face, particularly with the current housing crisis. However, we are committed to their continued protection. To do this, the NPPF sets out that planning policies relating to open space, sports and recreation facilities and opportunities for new provision should be based on robust and up-to-date assessments of need. This means that those existing open space, sports and recreational buildings and land should not be built on unless an assessment has been undertaken. This assessment should show either how they are surplus to needs or that there would be mitigation for the loss, making either equivalent or better provision in a suitable location. The framework also encourages communities to use their local and neighbourhood plans, an issue of importance to me too, to identify green areas of particular importance to them. These can then be given special protection by designating them as local green space, meaning that they cannot be impacted by development. Right Honourable and Honourable Members will be pleased to know that the draft revised NPPF framework maintains these protections, by all means.
Thank you. The Minister is very generous, but the point exactly I made in my speech is that the neighbourhood plan relating to one community in my constituency was completely overridden, or an attempt was made by the government's planning inspector to completely override the provisions made in the neighbourhood plan.
Well, the Honourable Lady may not know, but I too had that experience in a village called Oakley in my constituency as a backbencher, and as a result, the planning bill strengthened neighbourhood plans in planning consideration for planning inspectors, in particular prior to referendum. And one pledge I can make to her in my tenure in this job, however long that may be, is that I will do my best to promote and enhance and, if you like, strengthen neighbourhood plans, because I agree with her that they enable local communities to have the feeling that planning is done by them, not to them. And that very often they result in more housing, not less, and we should be using them more across the country. Now, Mr. Chairman, just to turn specifically to the Green Belt, obviously this is another key feature of our natural heritage, fundamentally aiming to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. It is a national policy, but one that is applied locally, with Green Belt land defined and protected by local planning authorities. The NPPF, by providing strong protection for the openness of Green Belt land, prevents inappropriate development. It makes clear that most new building is not appropriate there and should be refused planning permission except in very special circumstances. This sets a high bar for developers and is part of the reason why Green Belt protection has proved so effective over the past half-century. The draft revised framework remains committed to this protection. Currently, it states that changing Green Belt boundaries is possible only in exceptional circumstances using the local plan process of consultation and rigorous examination by the Planning Inspectorate. The draft revised framework proposes a clarification of the exceptional circumstances test. It sets out that a strategic plan-making authority would be able to alter a Green Belt boundary only if it can show it examined all other reasonable options for meeting the development needs it has identified. This means that an authority's strategy should take into account a number of different factors. For example, planning policies and decisions should give substantial weight to the value of using suitable brownfield land within settlements for homes and other identified needs, and support opportunities to remediate degraded or underused land. Another factor to be considered is the optimization of the density of development, ensuring that authorities have significantly raised minimum densities in towns and city centres and in other locations well served by public transport. Furthermore, the authority's strategy should be informed by discussion with neighbouring authorities to see if they could take some of the necessary development. Sometimes, exceptional circumstances may require land to be removed from the green belt. However, this does not mean that we are concreting over the beautiful landscapes to which the Honourable Lady referred, for which England is famed around the world. By all means.
The Minister's words are very welcome. He's been very generous with his time and are very well-meaning. But the point is that 425,000 new homes are proposed on the green belt in local plans as things stand now. How can that be exceptional? How can that represent exceptional circumstances?
Well, Mr. Chairman, proposed they may be. Whether they'll make it through the inspection procedure, and of course it still remains the right of the Secretary of State to call in places where this may be proposed that are of national importance. There are particular safeguards, but I would point it to the fact that these decisions are made by locally elected democratic politicians. And certainly where the issue she raised about engagement and about the decisions are made, I would urge her to take that up with her confrères and colleagues on the councils concerned, where she should be raising her concerns with them as well, as I hope she has, and I assume she has. I should just turn, though, she raised an issue about local housing need. A further consideration to Greenbelt policy is the calculation of local housing need. House prices are simply unaffordable in many places, meaning too many people are unable to get on the housing ladder. Each local authority should assess local housing need and plan to meet it in full where possible. As part of the package of planning reforms, we have introduced a more transparent standard method for calculating housing need. This aims to ensure that we make sure that we take a crucial first step of planning for the right number of homes. Although Greenbelt acts as a constraint, the draft revised framework sets out that the calculation should be carried out before assessing where the need could be met. This is because constraints like Greenbelt are relevant when assessing how to meet need, rather than assessing the scale of need. Once again, let me thank the Honourable Member for securing this valuable debate. And before I close, I just wanted to raise one particular issue that she talked about, which was local wildlife sites, which also are of particular importance to me. Now, it is going to be the case that the revised MPPF will clarify protections for local wildlife sites, and my predecessor, as Minister for Housing, met with the wildlife trusts collectively and wrote to MPs confirming this, and we can dig out a copy of that letter for the Honourable Lady. And I would just finally emphasise to her, again, the importance to me personally of neighbourhood plans. I have been in the forefront in my own constituency of promoting them as a way of controlling and directing the right kind of development in the right place that suits local people and is responsive to their needs. And as I say, I will do my best in this job to try and promote them for the future.
The question is that this House has considered planning policy relating to green belt and green space in Penistone and Stockholm